Hello and welcome back to the series Masters of the Chessboard. This is game number 32, and in this series we're going through the famous book by Richard Reti, Masters of the Chessboard, looking at each of the games in that book one at a time and Reti's analysis of those games. Here we are looking at the second game of Carl Schlechter, and his opponent in this game is Walter John. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any pictures of Walter John, so he's got a nice little smiley face instead. Schlechter has the white pieces, and he starts off by playing d4. We have d5, c4, going into the queen's gambit, e6, knight c3, f5, and this pawn formation, which will be finished after c6, is the stonewall defense. And black can play this quite often against d4. It's not the best defense against d4, but it's certainly playable, especially at the lower levels. It's also playable by white, especially at the club level as well. Not really so much at the top level. It's quite easy to defeat at the top level, but it's certainly possible at the club level. The idea of this defense, according to Reti, is to control e4 and hopefully try and cement the center, really gain a solid lock on the center in order to hopefully in the future push g5, g6 and g5, f4, g5, g4 and push f4 as well to try and generate a bit of a kingside attack. However, the weakness is that once the c6 pawn has been moved, once the pawn has been moved to c6, white will have a lot of pawns on light squares, and this bishop here is going to be incredibly weak. And this becomes quite a big issue actually later on in this game. The weakness of the dark squares is a key theme in this game. Now here we see knight f3, c6 finishing off the pawn structure, bishop f4, now bishop to d6. Now black is offering an exchange of bishops. They're hoping that after bishop takes, queen takes, they can try and play knight to d7 and push through e5, just freeing up their position and freeing up this light square bishop. However, Schlechter doesn't take. Instead, he plays e3. Now this hasn't been seen too often, this bishop g6 move or e3. However, when it has been seen, e3 has been winning quite overwhelmingly. Almost every game has been won by white in this position. And now the idea is that if black exchanges on f5, after e takes f5, white will then have an ability to create some pressure down this open e file, and with these two pawns and a rook on e1, they will have a lot of pressure on this e5 square, and also potentially even on this backwards e6 pawn. So black doesn't take. Instead, he plays knight f6. We have bishop to d3, queen c7. And now black's hoping to try and force white to take, because the threat is obviously to take back, and then take with the queen and win a pawn. However, Schlechter doesn't budge. He plays g3. Now here we have castles, knight to e4. Now this is a good outpost for the knight, but it's not necessarily permanent, because white's still got this f3 move. If you compare this to the e5 square, however, black can't kick anything away from e5 with a pawn. And we'll see that that's a key feature in the rest of this game. Now here we have queen to b3. And the threat here is if black just develops naturally, perhaps aiming to play knight f6 or something, then c takes d6, and c takes d6 would be met with knight to b5, which would just lose a piece. So E takes D5 is forced, but then this will just lose a pawn because of this pin. So because of that, black moves the king out of the way of the queen. It's always a good idea to try and be quite cautious when you see the queen on the same line as the king. And now we see rook a to c1. But now black gets a bit impatient. Black's not really willing to keep the tension or resolve any of the issues of c takes d5, and so instead takes on f4. Now here we have e takes f4, queen to f7, and now knight to e5. And this knight on e5 is pretty permanent. It can't be kicked away by any pawns, whereas this knight on e4 can be kicked away with the f3 pawn. And also, something that's worth noting is this knight on e4 can also be attacked by the light square bishop, whereas black has no dark square bishop, so this e5 square is always going to be permanently weak. Now here we see queen to e7, because the knight was attacking the queen. And now the natural move for white might be something like f3 to try and push this knight away and force it to exchange itself. But Schlechter finds a combination which gives him quite a bit more control over the e file. This is a semi-open file if the knight moves off it. So now Reti comments that this combination that Schlechter finds is actually fairly common, but it can be quite difficult to spot if you've never seen it before. So he recommends looking at it a few times and really trying to remember it, to almost imprint that pattern into your mind. So here we have bishop takes e4, f takes e4, and now f3. Now obviously if black does nothing, we have e takes f3, d takes f3, and knight takes e4. Sorry, f takes e4, d takes e4, and knight takes e4, which would just lose a pawn for black. So black takes on f3. Now rook c to e1. This pawn isn't going anywhere. It can be captured at a later point without too much effort. You know, it's attacked by the rook, it's attacked by the knight. After this knight moves, it'll be attacked by the queen. It's not going anywhere. Now here we have queen to c7. And now queen to a3, attacking the rook, and most importantly, actually eyeing all of the weak dark squares in the black position. And this makes it really quite difficult for black to finish their development. If they play something like knight d7 now, then queen e7 will come and make things quite awkward. And where's this rook really going? Obviously, if it goes to here or here, the queen will take it. If it goes to here, it will just be mate. Rook f6 might be a potential option, but black's position is just stuck. Black is just completely stuck. You know, how is he going to develop this bishop without losing this knight? And he can't take here because the queen's pinned. Black is just completely stuck here. So that's the beauty of queen a3, attacking the rook, but also controlling all of the dark squares around black's position. Now here we see king to g8, preventing the rook being, well, defending the rook and preventing the queen getting in, because the queen obviously still defends. Now we have rook takes f3, recapturing the pawn, knight to a6, b3, and now the queen side is secure. White's queen has done its job. Black's development has been made awkward. This knight on a6 is a little bit pointless now. And the queen's done its job on the queen side. So now it's able to return back to the king side. Now here we see queen to d8. c5, just securing the center and gaining more space. Knight to c7, queen to b2, bishop to d7, developing the bishop, but it's not really going to do much. And queen to c2, queen to e7, and now Schlechter doubles the rooks, and John brings in the final rook to e8. And now here with the centre secure, Schlechter starts pushing on the king side, g4. Now here we have bishop to c8, and again, black hasn't really got any meaningful moves. He's sort of just shuffling around. Whereas white has got quite a few moves. Rook to h3, another reason why g4 was played. So obviously the threat is mate, because the knight guards this f7 square. And this forces the g6. h6, I guess first of all you've got a potential fork here, but even then something like g5 could still come when you've got a hook, and this is probably the better move. You've just got to weigh in to the king then. So g6 is practically forced to try and defend mate. However, with this move, notice how even more dark squares in black's position are weakened. So white has forced a weakening of the black position, which white is able to take advantage of. Yes, white may have weakened their king a little bit with this g4 pawn, but how is black actually going to take advantage of this? They can't. Now here, after this g6 pawn push, we see b4. And Reti comments that Schlechter liked to do this style of attack. He liked to attack across the entire board. And Reti comments that in this position we see a familiar pattern that we've seen quite a few times before. White has a space advantage. White has a very dominant knight against black's rubbish bishop. And the centre is locked. Now what do we know? When the centre is locked, you can start attacking on the flanks, and an attack on the flanks is even more effective when you have a positional advantage. In this instance, the dominant knight and the space advantage. And so that's what we're seeing. We're seeing Schlechter start attacking on the flanks. We've seen it time and time again. And white in this game is now preparing a potential attack on either the queen side or the king side. And he doesn't know which one he's going to go for at this point. He's instead going to try and wait and see how black defends, and then choose to attack on the weaker side of the board. Now here we have queen to f6, doubling up, attacking the pawn. Rook h to f3, doubling up and defending the pawn. Rook to e7, a4, a6, now knight to d1. Now, Schlechter wants to play g5. After g5, white will have a lot of control over the f6 and the h6 squares, these two weak squares in the black position. However, after g5, the queen can potentially come to f5, trying to force a bit of a queen trade, potentially being able to double up as well and obtain some pressure on this f4 pawn. So because of that, Schlechter is playing knight d1, intending to go to knight e3, which will defend this f5 square, meaning that after g5 the queen can't come down. And also from e3, after g5, the knight can then jump in to g4 and would then be attacking either f6 or h6. He could jump into either of these squares. So that's the reason for knight d1. And now here we see rook to g7, and knight to e3 as we planned. Queen to e7, g5, bishop d7, knight to g4, and notice how black is just sort of defenseless. Black has no way to actually stop white from realizing his plan. He's just sitting back and letting white do it. Now here with bishop to e8, knight to h6 check, king h8, queen to e2, queen d8, knight e to g4, bishop to d7, queen to e5, so the queen takes up this weak, starts controlling this weak square, knight to e8, rook to h3, and now we have queen to c7, trying to get a bit of a queen trade. Note that if something like queen e7, then Reti gives queen b6, which just paralyzes black even further. But instead we have queen to c7 by black, essentially trying to get a queen trade. However, white just continues with knight to f6, and now Reti comments that white's strategy has been a success. His pieces are established on all of the weak dark squares in black's position. He has an overwhelming space advantage. So white is strategically winning in his position. And to put in perspective, the computer evaluation gives white at plus 5.78, which is pretty damn high. White's basically up a rook in this position. Now black exchanges queens on e5. We have f takes c5. Note that this queen exchange was essentially forced. If black tried to go back with the queen instead of exchanging, then knight takes h7 would come. And after king takes h7, knight to f7 check would just be game over. So exchanging on e4 in e5 is practically forced. We have f takes e5, opening up this f file. Now rook to e7. Note that the knight controls f7, so black can't quite double on the f file. Now rook h to f3, and now black has to exchange on f6 because Reti says that if black doesn't exchange, then there might be something like knight takes d5 here. After rook takes, the threat is rook to g8 check. So if you take the knight because you don't want to lose your rook, then rook f8's coming, king g8, and rook g8 is mate, because all of these squares are defended. So Reti comments that black is practically forced to exchange on f6. But after rook takes f6, rook takes f6, e takes f6, white has now got a protected pass pawn with a tempo on a rook and has regained control of this e5 square. Note that here white hasn't really got a huge amount of control over the e5 square. They've got a pawn there, but the pawn isn't really doing much. They want the square e5 to put a piece on it. And here they now have that option. They now have full control over e5. Now here we have rook to e8, knight f7 check, king to g8, and knight to e5, regaining control of the e5 square. Now we have rook to d8. Obviously the fork was being threatened. So rook to d8. And now king g2. And Reti comments that before breaking through, white intends to centralize his king as much as possible. So basically just wants to improve the position of all of his pieces before trying to get a definitive breakthrough. There's no reason to go for a breakthrough right now because black hasn't got anything to really play for or try and do. Black hasn't got any counterplay. So white can just continue to improve his position piece after piece after piece and then play for a breakthrough. And Reti comments that this procedure is quite common in positions where you where you may have had a good position in the middle game, but you weren't able to decide the game through a decisive attack. And that this strategy of just trying to get into a positionally winning endgame and improve your position again slowly is quite a good way of transitioning from a middle game to a one endgame. Now here we see king to f8, sorry, h4, bishop to e8, and the reason for bishop to e8 is white may have wanted to try and play h5 to try and get a breakthrough on the king side. So bishop to e8 just prevents this breakthrough because it x-rays the h5 square. However, black can only defend one side of the board with our pieces currently, and the bishop is sort of leaving the queen side undefended. Now here we see king to f3, bishop to f7, king to f4, king to e8, and now rook to b1. The rook slides over to the queen side, ready to get some counterplay on the queen side. We have king to f8 and b5. And in this position, black resigned because everything's just lost here. Now Reti gives a potential continuation to try and show just why everything is lost. It gives a takes b5, a takes b5, bishop e8 to try and again defend these pawns. But after b takes c6, bishop takes c6, knight takes, pawn takes, king to e5. Note how this e5 square throughout the entire game has been quite common. When white transitioned into an endgame and took back on f6, white was very likely envisioning the king being on e5. And that's what would have happened. King to e5 almost certainly would have happened in the game. And now, in this position, black can't defend e6. They've also got a weakness on c6. Like, for instance, after rook e8, rook to b7, what's black going to do here? You know, if the king moves, then there's a fork. If the rook moves, then we then win this pawn. And again, you can't really just come down because of the threat of mate. With the pawn controlling the g7 square, this is just mate. So black is just sort of lost here, with this king e5 followed by potentially rook b7, maybe even rook b6 in some instances, although rook b7 is almost certainly going to be the better move. This is just lost for black. And of course, we're completely discounting this h7 pawn in these discussions as well. And so there we have it. That was game number 32. And it would have ended in this position. We're seeing a few games now go to the end game. It's quite good actually, because I know a lot of the earlier games we saw sort of got decided in the middle game. But these games are quite consistently going into the end game. And it's quite an instructive example as to how you're able to really control a lot of the weak colour if there's a weak colour complex in your opponent's position, you can control those weak squares. In this instance, there was the weak dark squares in the black position, and white was able to dominate those black squares, those dark squares. And we saw white just really did. First of all, they dominated e5, then they made more weak squares on f6 and h6 to control those, and then they turned one of those weak squares into a passed pawn, and then eventually put their king in the endgame on one of the weak squares. So quite an instructive game in that way as to how to control any potentially weak colour complexes in your opponent's position, and also the risks of creating weak colour complexes. Yeah, so there we have it. That was game number 32. I hope you liked this game. If you did, please like, comment and subscribe, and I hope to see you next time. Thank you for watching.